Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the Friends of the Village Library of Cooperstown, welcome to the second in a series of panel discussions. Looking in the mirror, Cooperstown reflects on racism, and actually, I'm sorry, this is the third session with today's focus on education. My name is Leanne Hirabayashi, and I have the honor and privilege of co-moderating these sessions. It looks like we have around 30 attendees, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. The purpose of this panel discussion, the reason this came about, is a response in particular to the murder of George Floyd and the nationwide protests that erupted in support of the Black Lives Movement. The goals of this panel series are to examine the impact of racism on our community, to learn how to confront bias and inequities locally, identify actions that individuals, groups, and the community can take to address racism and create a more equitable Cooperstown. And we've got 4 sessions this fall. As I said, this is the third one. And then we'll have 3 or 4 more in January/February 2021. Let me go over a few items related to logistics and format of this online discussion. There will be a couple brief messages from the host and sponsor of the session. Then I'll introduce our distinguished panelists. And after the introductions, each panelist will give a 5-minute presentation. If there are any presentation-specific questions from the audience or other panelists, we'll address them right after that person's presentation. Then we'll have a discussion and question and answer session. Now for attendees, at the bottom of the window, you'll see icons in a bar similar to what I'm showing here. Please note that chat is disabled and we are not going to be using that raise hand feature. We'll just be using that Q&A tool. So so if you have a question, just click on that Q&A icon and send it in. Our co-moderator, who I'll be introducing shortly, will be monitoring that Q&A tool and asking questions on your behalf. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, and we likely will not have an opportunity if you're just submitting a comment to do so. So just keep that in mind. Also, if we are combining questions, you may feel like you may think that your question in particular wasn't answered, but it may have been combined with somebody else's. So again, if we don't get to your question, please I just want to thank you for your understanding on that. Finally, just note that these questions are being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available on the Friends of the Library web page. So now just a brief message from the Friends of the Village Library, the organizer of this series. The mission of the library is to promote cultural literacy, enhance community engagement with the library, and the way they're doing that is through advocacy and direct financial contributions, fundraising, and educational and recreational programs, such as the one that you're watching tonight. If you want to see any links to resources on racism that are gathered by the library staff and volunteers, please go to the Village Library of Cooperstown.org website and go to the Friends of the Village Library tab. The League of Women Voters of the Cooperstown area is grateful for this opportunity to join the Friends of the Village Library in this panel discussion. The League believes that diversity, equity, and inclusion are central to its current and future success in engaging all individuals, households, community, and policymakers in creating a more perfect democracy. And we'd like to take this brief opportunity to remind the audience of some important upcoming dates related to the election. So in October, just around the corner here, October 24 to November 1 is early voting at the Otsego County Meadows Complex. Times do vary depending on the day, so go to otsegocounty.com for the details. On October 26th, there will be a candidates forum for the New York State 121st Assembly District that is going to be moderated by the League of both the Cooperstown and Oneonta League. So go to the Cooperstown League website that you see up here, lwvcooperstownarea.org, for more information about that. October 27, that's the last day to apply for by mail for an absentee ballot. November 2 is the last day to apply in person for an absentee ballot. November 3rd is Election Day, and the last day to postmark your absentee ballot or deliver it to a polling place. If you want to find out any and all any questions you have about the election, you can go to vote411.org. It's a great resource, and we strongly recommend that you use that. So let me go on with introductions. I'm going to start with our my co-moderator, Joanne Gardner. She is on a leave of absence right now from her position as a licensed teaching assistant, and she's on the board of the Cooperstown, Oneonta, and Otsego County Film Partnership. Lou Val Brown is an experienced educator who has held positions as a teacher, assistant principal, school CIO, and superintendent of schools. He is now the superintendent of the Ithaca City School District in Ithaca, New York. And during his tenure in Ithaca, the school has experienced unprecedented levels of success. Lou Val has facilitated conversations in multiple communities that have resulted in transformative shifts in culture and achievement. Using systems thinking in schools, Lou Val has implemented innovative programs, redesigned learning spaces, and numerous technology initiatives. Rebecca Burke-Cialo is a high school English teacher at Cooperstown Central School, where she has taught for 19 years. She graduated from Harvard College with a BA in English and received her master's in education from the University of New England. For 10 years, Rebecca directed the Vagina Monologues in Cooperstown, helping to raise money for local organizations that support women and children who are survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Along with her students, Rebecca has helped to establish CCS's Gay Straight Alliance, now the Identity Alliance Club. Mother, teacher, director, and activist in her spare time, Rebecca likes to write, read, and help make her corner of the world just a little better. Angela Eldred was born and raised in Cooperstown, New York. She has a bachelor's degree in Planned Studies in the alternative education from Ithaca College, and she has a master's degree in English education from the 180 Days Project at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. This is Angela's 20th year of teaching. Jacqueline Kalari Robinson is the mother of Julian and Alessandra Robinson and wife and partner of Dr. Kelly Robinson. Jackie is a nursing PhD student and research assistant for the DOJ grant Tracking Our Truth, providing advocacy-driven medical forensic care to American Indian communities in rural and urban Wisconsin. And Jude Robinson is an amateur photographer and filmmaker located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Jude uses he, him, and they, them pronouns and is a proud member of the LGBTQIA+ community. He studies currently at Haverford College with a major in film and media studies. And now let me go ahead and stop my share. And I think we're ready to begin. So let's go ahead and start off with Jude Robinson. Why don't you get us started?
All righty. Hello, everyone. My name is Jude. If I knew you in high school, you probably knew me as Julian. And I'm just going to open a little bit talking about my experience with racism at Cooperstown specifically. And I feel like I had a very particular experience when it came to racism, identity, yada, yada, yada. And that begins with the fact that I moved to Cooperstown when I was 15 years old. So already I was not well acquainted with the area. I did not know the people. I did not know anyone. And frankly, coming into Cooperstown, coming into a small town, was something that I was very unacquainted with. And so I spent socially that first year at Cooperstown not really knowing anybody. Nobody really came up to me and tried to socialize with me. I made very few friends and spent a lot of that first year alone, wondering what the heck is wrong with me. academically, I was, uh, suffice it to say, I was not challenged by Cooperstown, and I don't think that was because of a lack of resources. Um, as I came into the school, there were uh, members of the administration who looked at my transcripts and frankly just believed the worst of me and did not think that I was capable of taking higher level or harder classes. It was just a matter of I'm just going to go directly off of what's on the transcript and kind of dismiss you from there if you think that you can do any better. So my first year at Cooperstown, I was taking classes with mostly people a year younger than me or other people that just didn't have a very good grasp on any material that I was already fluent in, because of my past coming from either private schools or boarding schools when it comes to my freshman year of high school. I think that what I would like to get out of this talk and what perspective I would like to bring to this talk is the perspective of someone who did not did not have the opportunities to achieve at Cooperstown as particularly as like a white person would, as they were a white person or someone who was born and raised in Cooperstown. There's definitely some sort of bias that I could sense from the Cooperstown administration, that I was not good enough and that I was not smart enough, I was not capable enough to actually take on challenges. Um, I definitely think there were teachers that spoke and advocated for me, some of which are on this panel right now. But I think that when I speak to other people at my current college, Haverford College, about my high school experience and the reason why, I wasn't really able to get into being a math major. I came into college wanting to be a math major or a history major, and already I was tremendously behind. And that's not because we have bad teachers at Cooperstown. It's because of a lot of things. And for me, not having an opportunity to take higher level math at the high school level is something that really held me back and still is over my shoulder to this day. Um, yeah, I think that we as a community, or at least the Cooperstown community, has to kind of take a step back and reevaluate the ways that we treat people who are unfamiliar or unaccustomed to the small town upstate New York environment. If I can levy any criticism, is that Cooperstown was very insular and was not really prepared for someone like me to come through. And I still keep in contact with a good number of people from Cooperstown. Still have great relationships from people there. So clearly everyone isn't bad, but I think that there are some social and institutional levels of racism that need to be addressed in order for Cooperstown to become the welcoming and accepting community that it claims to be.
Thank you very much, Jude. Thank you for your perspective. And Jackie?
Thank you, my beautiful child. So my name is Jacqueline Clary Robinson. I am the mother of Jude and Alessandra Robinson. I identify and I am a white woman who is the mother of children who are not. So I think what I want to talk about is that as parents, the parents that are out there, we all want the same thing for our children. We want our children to be offered every opportunity possible. And my husband and I, Kelly, have worked really hard to make sure that that was true for our two children. And They went to very, very good schools. Both of them had stellar, they're both rule followers. They both had stellar academic records. And I walked into the Cooperstown High School. We originally are from the East Coast, but we moved to the West Coast. And when I walked into Cooperstown High School, I was filled with optimism, and I was so idealistic. I'm back on the East Coast. People are like me. It'll be great. No worries. And my experience is that my son was not listened to. He wasn't. He couldn't. Anything that he said about his academic record was refuted. No, that's not going to work. You can't do this. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do this. And I had to have a different role than I ever had in my children's education. I mean, I've always advocated. I was present at everything that either one of them, both of them have done, but I really felt like I had to advocate. And that meant I was on school grounds a lot. I was afraid for my kid at times and worried, not making friends, not being included. And that first year was really, really difficult for all of us. By the time he started to really prove himself academically, things started to get a little bit better, but he was still reading books and taking classes that he had taken once or twice before. Yeah, a great example of this is he went to a private school in Milwaukee. 8th grade, he took algebra. He took algebra and pre-calc and trig in the private school he went to in Arizona, and he had to take it for the third time at Cooperstown High. So this was a completely different experience for me as the mother of Allie and Julian. And I've always had to advocate, but this was definitely something different for me and for us. And it made the experience of living there a little bit more difficult. You know, we just had to sort of guide our own path. We hosted a lot of game board parties at our house so Julian could have people over. I mean, we tried very, very hard to acclimate to the small rural community. And I know it was the hardest on my kid, and it was always upsetting. And I know that that's impacted him until today. And so that's why I was kind of anxious and looking forward to this presentation, because I know that the parents out there are just like me. They love their children, they want the best for their children, and they want their children to be given every opportunity. And I don't feel like Julian was given that at Cooperstown High.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And are there any questions, Joanne, for either Jude or Jackie that are specific to them? Okay. And do any of the other panelists have any questions for Jude or Jackie? Okay.
There are no questions.
Thank you.
At this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jackie. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Angela, please.
Hi. So I'm Angela Eldred, and I am a teacher at Cooperstown High School. I was also born and raised in Cooperstown. I think the first thing I want to say is, Jude and Jacqueline, I hear you. And I think that from what I've heard, we failed you. And now we got to think, how can we make it better? And that's going to be the hard work. And that's going to be a lot of reflection, I think, on it. And it should be a lot of reflection on our part. How can we make this better? Because we can't allow it to happen again. So I kind of want to start with that. So I was born and raised in Cooperstown, and kind of the opposite of what Jude was talking about as far as the insular town. And it does, there is a difference between how you're treated when you're born and raised here and your family is rooted here. I mean, it goes back to my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And going to school here, I definitely had biases, and there's no diversity. And I remember being in elementary school and finding out that there was a student in my grade that was Jewish, and that was like a huge diverse thing for Cooperstown. So no diversity at all. And I kind of developed these biases and these thoughts based on my experiences, as we all do. And then I went to college. I actually went to, Dr. Brown, I went to Ithaca College. And while I was there, I had some wonderful professors that introduced me to some writing by Beverly Tatum. If you haven't read her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It might be a little antiquated, I'm not sure, but she changed my life. And then I got to meet her later on and go to some of her classes. And she changed my life. She changed my perspective. And I started to do a lot of volunteering in the Ithaca area. So I volunteered at the Alternative Community School, the BOCES Alternative School down in the Ithaca area. I also was at the, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get it wrong, the middle school. Can't remember the name.
DeWitt or Boynton?
DeWitt.
DeWitt.
Middle.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And then I also worked in the South Hill, like the housing projects, and with an urban outreach program. So that was huge for a kid from Cooperstown to suddenly be surrounded by all this diversity. And I was learning and I was growing, and I knew that I wanted to do something with social justice, and just all my perspectives were changing. Then I had the opportunity to go to the 180 Days in Springfield project, which is you teach for 180 days for a full year in Springfield, Massachusetts. And so if Ithaca wasn't a culture shock, to then go to Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a large city, and to teach middle school children, and to frankly, sometimes I was the only white person in the room. Now, granted, I could go home to my privilege, and I was well aware of the white privilege that I held, but I had never been in a situation like that. I'm from Cooperstown. So that was a lot of learning, a lot of growth. I had to deal with the issue of being the white savior. You know, you don't want to present yourself as that, and it was very difficult, but I loved every second of it. Then the way life is, I ended up moving back to Sydney, New York, which is very rural, if I could say more rural than Cooperstown. And so I had all these ideas that I had about social justice education that was working in Springfield, and then I had to adjust because rural schools are so unique in that there's no diversity. So their lens for, their lens is very small because they don't have those experiences necessarily. Some kids that I worked with in Sydney never leave the county, or like, you know, the Delaware Otsego County area. So that's their lens, and their experiences were very small. So I had to take it to just opening that lens a little bit and a little bit and a little bit at a time. And I know I kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and it would close, so to speak. So I learned that I just had to crank it a little bit. So I started programs like the SLAM program that brought a lot of kids from Suco. And for the kids that worked with these SLAM poets, these were the first people, diverse people that they had ever met in their lives, that they had never worked hand in hand with someone before. Then I moved back to Cooperstown and just remembered how it was. And I think I bring that social justice lens to, I try to everything that I teach. All the literature lends itself so beautifully to social justice issues. And now Rebecca and I have been talking, and we're on the ground floor, maybe not even the basement, of developing a program specifically for rural schools to help them deal with social justice education, because it's so unique, and everything that exists out there is based on gather from your experiences. Well, what if you don't have any experiences with diversity? Where do we go from there? And just thinking about bringing awareness, bringing activism, and trying to change it, that lens just a little bit at a time. And it has to start young. That's important too. So.
Thank you, Angela. Let's go ahead with Rebecca, just so that we can have the two teacher experience, and then we'll see if there are some questions related to the teachers. So go right ahead, Rebecca.
Hi, so I'm Rebecca Burke-Cialo. I'm a teacher at Cooperstown Central School, and I too want to start by thanking you, Jude, for sharing your story and your experience, because these conversations are incredibly important. And I think that that's one of the biggest thing that needs to come out of this series, is that we have to have these hard conversations, and we have to be willing to listen, because if we don't listen and if we don't have the hard conversations, that's where growth happens, right? Growth happens when we're uncomfortable. And so I have so much respect for you. I'm so proud of you, and I want to thank you. And I'm so happy to be here. So thank you for inviting me. I'm quickly just going to give a little background information. I've been teaching at Cooperstown this is my 19th year, but I moved to Cooperstown, the Hartwick area, when I was in 10th grade. Before that, I moved a lot. By the time I had moved to Hartwick, I had moved 15 times in my life, and I had gone to all different schools, from small private schools to bigger public schools. And then I came to Cooperstown in 10th grade. So it was actually in college, being introduced by my education professors and my literature professors and my history professors, when I realized the gaps that I had in my own education, when I realized that I always knew I wanted to be a teacher from the time that I was 5 years old. So that has never changed. It's never wavered. And being in college, realizing that, over 80% at the time of teachers were white, and yet over 50% of the student population in the United States were students of color. Or the fact that a lot of my history had gaps in it, just my history curriculum had gaps, the things that I had learned, the things that had been left out. And then the conversations about what stories I had read in my English classes throughout all the different schools that I attended, realizing that most of them were written by dead white men. And so when I became a teacher, here I am, I'm part of that 80+% of teachers who are white teachers. And I made a promise. I wanted to make sure that, one, my classroom was always a place where students felt safe to be themselves, safe to explore the world, safe to ask the hard questions and to have the hard conversations. Because what better place to have those hard conversations than in a classroom? Like, a classroom is supposed to be a place where you can, question things, and that a teacher shouldn't be, giving you the answers, but opening all these different doors. And stories really beautifully lend themselves to that, as Angela said. And so when I started teaching in Cooperstown, one of my goals was I wanted to revamp the curriculum. I wanted to bring in more stories, more books, more poetry, because Cooperstown has no diversity. It lacks diversity. So but yet we live in a world that is incredibly diverse. So how do I bring those stories into my classroom? And it's by looking at the shelves and saying, okay, is it time for this to go? Is it time to bring some new things and put them on the shelves? So from there, the shelves that I stared at as a student in Cooperstown for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, now have books by Ralph Ellison on them and Toni Morrison. And, so that was where I kind of started. But I also want to just say that I think that classrooms are really sacred spaces. And we, as educators, have a responsibility to have the hard conversations like this and to be facilitators of discussion. So after George Floyd's murder, it was another reckoning for me, and there have been other reckonings in the past. And I always question, what more can I do? How can I make my space in the world better for my students? And when they leave, making the world better themselves, and being open to conversations and being open to differences. So I read a lot, and I watch videos, and I read articles, and I talk to people, and I've always done that, but I feel like in the past few months especially, I'm like obsessed with it. And so a few months ago, I found, new to me, not new to the world at all, Dr. Bettina Love, who's a professor, University of Georgia. and she's coined the term abolitionist teaching. And I am obsessed with this idea. And so it really is about teachers knowing how to talk about racism and homophobia in their classroom. They're not afraid to call it out. They have the courage to put themselves on the line no matter what, no matter what. And I think that, you know, we are the front line to making sure that our students are, it's not just about being safe. It's not just about surviving, which she talks about. It's about thriving. It's about, you know, having the opportunities, as Jacqueline talked about. And so it's about teachers organizing. It's about teachers not being afraid, you know, to step on toes and to be loud in justice and loud in truth and to be centered always in love. And so listening to her speak, if you haven't had a chance, you know, Google her. I was like, yes, this, not just, you know, yes, we hear a lot like anti-racism training, but abolitionist teaching, that's like where it's at. I kind of connect it to, you know, running our identity alliance at school, the GSA that Cooperstown has. And I've always really, I cannot stand the word tolerate, because just for someone to say they tolerate you, that feels terrible. I also struggle with acceptance. That's not good enough either. But when we get to the level of celebrate, I celebrate you, that's our goal, right? That's our goal, to celebrate each other. And that's, you know, with Dr. Bettina Love, that's how I feel abolitionist teaching is. It's about courage and love and celebration. So I'm 40 years old and I've been teaching for 19 years and I have about 11 more years to go. But I vow that I will always question and read and think. And if I do something wrong, I want you to call me out so that I can be better. So that's kind of how I try to live every day. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it. I'm far from it. I do want to just talk about 2 projects that we're working on. Well, Angela actually talked about one in terms of the personal project that we're working on, bringing this program to rural schools. And we are in the basement with that. Like, it's bare bones, you know, right now. The other is through PTA, and thank you so much. PTA has always been really wonderful and supportive of the teachers at Cooperstown. We looked at our curriculum, 7 through 12, in the 7 through 12 building, and we talked about what books do we want to incorporate this year. So through a grant, a donation from the PTA, we have added 2 books to every classroom. Some of the titles are Driving While Black by Gretchen Soren, who's a local author. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. So these are books that we're adding to our curriculums because, like we talked about, stories are really beautiful ways. They're conduits of change. So I think that's all I have. I thank you so much for having me, and I'm done.
Thank you very much. Joanne, were there any questions specific to either Angela or Rebecca?
Yes, hold on one second. So there's a couple for Ange and Rebecca. First one, Rebecca and Angela, how can Cooperstown parents and community members contribute to your rural diversity program?
I would say first give us time to create it. You know, we have, I think, a really great idea with really wonderful people in the community. You know, we've talked with Gretchen Soren, and, you know, so we have a lot of really wonderful insight into what we're going to do. But I thank you for that question, because once we're in a place, we'll reach out with what we need, I think, when we figure out exactly what that'll be.
And I think just based on hearing Jackie and Jude today, I think just knowing if anyone wants to send me an email, how we could do better. I think that that's important because I have my experiences, I have my children's experiences, but I don't know everyone's experiences. So just knowing how could we do better? Let me hear your voice, and then we can work, Rebecca and I can work on kind of how could we change that systematic racism, or you know, how can we change curriculum? How can we work on this? How can we do better? And if we don't hear the criticism, or the constructive criticism or the issues, then we'll never improve. So I think I would like to hear how, from people how we could do a better job at Cooperstown.
I would just like to add something as someone who works at Cooperstown and as a parent. Reach out to your kid's favorite teacher. They are the ones who are going to be really, really helpful. And your kid likes them for a reason. So don't be afraid to email.
Thank you.
Okay, there is another question for Angela and Rebecca. As teachers, what are some of the difficulties, particularly on the institutional level, that make it hard to address issues of bias in our schools? What do you wish the administration would do?
Well, I think that when we look at education, we walk through life in different structures, right? We're parts of all different structures. Education is a structure, healthcare is a structure, you know, and I think that there are broken pieces to each structure. And when you're in the structure, as an educator, I'm in the educational structure. My job is to make sure that I'm helping to fix it and to revamp it and to make it better. I honestly think that the biggest thing that we need to do in education is to start with these conversations. I do think, and I'm not necessarily just saying teachers in Cooperstown, but I think that teachers are afraid to have tough conversations about race, about mental health, about addiction. And yet those are all things that being human is about, you know, and so I think that for me, it's about having those hard conversations and being willing to have those hard conversations.
Great. Thank you.
That's a tough question. I think that from my experience, I feel as though when you're talking about race or any kind of social justice, you're taking calculated risks because you're not really, you can't predict when you open up that conversation exactly what's going to be said from the mouths of 15, 16-year-olds. So I've always felt supported by administration for taking those calculated risks. I've always heard from them, that's important, I love what you're doing. They've never told me no, but I do think that just putting that out there, this culture of fear, getting rid of the culture of fear, and if you take this calculated risk, we will support you. But that's my experience, that's what I've always heard.
Great. Thank you. You know, I want to go ahead and I think there are maybe a couple more questions for those for Rebecca and Angela, but I don't want to miss out on what Louvel has to say, and then we can bring the questions back as we need to. So Louvel, why don't you, you're batting clean up here, so if you can tell us what you're thinking.
I'm in a good spot. Thank you for this opportunity, this privilege and honor to be here, and I'm truly enjoying this beautiful conversation. If I may, I will respond to much of what I've heard, because much of what I'm hearing is no different from the conversations and stories I've been hearing all of my life. I mean, I've been in public education for 25 years, and we're having the same conversation. My lived experience includes me growing up in a small rural town just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. So I'm a Central Virginia guy, and I grew up with a cohort of 10 Black boys, of which one was my twin brother, and my twin brother and I are the only two left. And what I would, and as we tracked, why is that? It's because of the love we didn't receive at school. We all had loving homes, but the love we didn't get at school, as Bettina Love, who's a good friend of mine, and we do a lot of work together right now, Bettina Love would say, our spirits got murdered when we got into schools. So this issue is one that we've been talking about, we've been studying for decades, and yet we still are having this conversation. And what I will present to you all is we failed to institute a process and follow a process and then have the courage to see that process through to change culture. You know, the culture changing process, and I've written about this, the culture changing process starts with self-reflection. We need to say we need to call it out. We know that we're institutionally oppressive organizations. Schools are that. We're racist, sexist, classist, ableist. We are oppressive. What we've done in our schools is not even engage in these conversations with our young people or with one another about how we are oppressive or how we marginalize young people and adults, how we are racist. See, that's self-reflection, and typically the conversation stops right there in school districts. That conversation needs to start there with us just saying that out loud. And Bettina Love would say, if she and I travel the country and we have this conversation, we've had people literally run out of the room. And most recently, they'll turn their cameras off and log off of the Zoom call when we just say that. But see, it doesn't stop there. After the reflection about who we are, we then need to get to the conflict. See, if we truly reflect, conflict is going to be inevitable. But what's optional is the combat. And see, this conflict that we must engage in now is about who we are as organizations. What is school culture? See, I heard something earlier, and I hear this everywhere I go on. We have no diversity, or we aren't very diverse. Every school, every community has a significant amount of diversity. And too often we've confused diversity. We have not decoupled this word diversity from the conversation about school culture. And we pretty much boiled down diversity to race, but every school has a significant amount of diversity. When I talked about those characteristics and how we've been oppressive to so many people, that is your diversity. And every school has a population of young people or multiple populations of young people that's not serving. And when you look at who they are, you will see where your diversity lies. So this conversation is not all about race, it's about culture. And as we have conversations and conflict about culture, we will then have to understand who we are as school districts. So if I were to say to you, we have a culture that includes these characteristics: perfectionism. I think we're seeing that play out right now when everyone wants us to be perfect with virtual learning or perfect with in-person, whatever you're doing. A sense of urgency. I want to know what it looks like right now before I send my kid back. We're, fear of open conflict. I think I've heard some of that tonight. A right comfort, only one right way. Worshiping of the written word, power hoarding, paternalism. See, as I speak to those characteristics, I think if we have more time, we could probably all agree that those are characteristics of school culture. And when you dig into the research, and Beverly talks about this a lot, she was here last year, when you dig into research, you pull up the research that's connected to white supremacy culture, those characteristics are the ones that are listed. And typically this is where I lose everybody else, because no one wants to admit that the culture of schools is built and founded on white supremacy. And it was never built and never intended to serve young people who look like me. See, the inequities that we've been talking about tonight are not a bug in our systems, they're a feature in our systems. And so until we can engage in the conflict now, because once we understand what our culture is, we got to do something about it. And unless you believe in some kind of racial hierarchy, because typically folks say, we're not racist, or this supremacy culture doesn't exist, then that's when I share the data. Because unless you believe in some kind of racial hierarchy, you cannot look at our data and not say that we're institutionally oppressive and racist and classist and sexist and ableist. Because of all those characteristics I'm naming there, we'll see in our data that young people aren't achieving. And then after the reflection, the conflict, we can then get to policy changes. Because the stuff that we're talking about, and as the first we've studied policy in a deep way for 2 decades, is written into our policies. When was the last time folks looked at the Board of Education policy manual? And see, what I will say to you is every one of those policies, the words that speak to the kind of oppression and marginalization that we want to eradicate from our system is written into, the words will jump off the page for you. But I know that you can't change policy until you've gone through the reflection and conflict that's needed to even get to that stage. And see, this is typically where leaders like myself, superintendents, board of education, people find all kinds of reasons for us not to be in those jobs anymore. I don't know of a superintendent in this country who's led a real conversation about anti-racism and equity and changed a significant number of policies and survived it. Nor do I know of a board of education that's done that. Because when you start to change, culture does not change until policy changes first. And see, when changing the policies, to move away from things like perfectionism or worshiping of the written word. See, if you know, grading alone is an indication of perfectionism and worshiping of the written word. So could y'all imagine if we wanted to change the grading policy at Cooperstown High School tomorrow, what would happen? Well, how about the code of conduct? So when you change the policy, ultimately it will start to change the culture, but typically we can't survive to get to that place. So anyway, I'm going, and I'm gonna stop there because I don't want too many people to log off of this call. But if you really want to get serious about this conversation, let's get serious about it. And it should start with some reflection about who we are. And don't just stop and not get uncomfortable or not engage in the conflict, because if you're going to truly have a conversation about who you are, the research is very clear about who we are. And when I say the word white supremacy culture, you can't say, no, that's not true, or run out of the room. You got to lean into that conversation. What about supremacy culture is also embedded in our schools? And then changing the policies. Our system has been designed for certain young people to achieve and many others not to even be there. And the policy is the only way we're going to change that. And I don't know of many school districts that have survived to get to that place. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to more of this dialogue this evening.
Thank you very much, Louvel. Do any of the panelists have any questions or comments for each other before we get into the questions from the audience?
Dr. Brown, as an English teacher, and you started talking about worship of the written word, could you go into that a little in a little more detail? That piqued my interest and then also made me a little uncomfortable. So I think I need to hear about that.
And maybe I won't talk so much about an individual class and practice. Let's just talk about our hiring practices. I don't know about Cooperstown, but every school district in the country is struggling with getting diversity into their schools. I don't know how many Black teachers are in Cooperstown, but most places I go don't have any. And you always wonder why. And I always, let's go to our hiring practices and let's look at the application process. And because of our confirmation biases and our implicit biases, most folks of color don't get past the application process based on what's written or not written in the packet of worship of the written word. And I'm sure the folks on this call have all sat in on an interview process. And what do you look at first? The application, right? When as we know that the cultures that we're trying to attract, cultures like me, that is much more about our verbal expressiveness and other ways to express who we are and what we can do and what we will bring in lieu of the written word. Now, we've had to master the written word and our verbal expressiveness just to get our foot in the door. We got to be twice as good to get half a chance. So without going to a classroom, I can just talk about our hiring practices. That is an oppressive system that has prevented young people of color to get into our schools, which is negatively impacting our data for young people like myself and those on the call. So everyone, if I were to go on and on about individual classroom practice, I would just start with grading practices. And as an English teacher, we could have a nice, healthy debate about the worship of the written word. And as someone who had to write my dissertation twice, I know how our educators worship that more so than what's here and how we can express what we know.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from the panelists? Okay. Joanne, why don't we take some questions from our audience? We have quite a few. So.
Yes, sure. So to sort of jump off from where Dr. Brown left off, the question is more directed towards CCS, but does anybody know if CCS has instituted efforts to diversify its staff and teaching faculty? Conversations are important, but role models are too.
Anybody aware of that? No? Okay. I guess not, or at least not that we know of.
And okay, so here's a question for Jude. How do you think a teacher at Cooperstown could do a better job of recognizing a student's strengths? How can they build better relationships where they understand students' needs and goals for the future?
This is a complicated question for me, because my problem at Cooperstown wasn't that I had teachers who didn't think I was capable. I think from the first day at Cooperstown, I remember walking into Miss Leinhardt's class, Angela's class, and immediately like starting up a conversation about it was probably about either 1984 or Fahrenheit 451. It was something. It was one of those books, and and I remember talking about those at like to no end with her, and my entire sophomore year. Um, I had a very good rapport with her and continued to engage with her, and like she would give me book recommendations and like I would read them in my study halls and all that stuff. So I don't think my problem with Cooperstown was the fact that that teachers didn't recognize my strengths. I think that my problem with Cooperstown was on a far more administrative level. That regardless of how well I was performing in classes, and regardless of how many recommendations I would get from teachers, um, I had to fight tooth and nail to get every single AP or like advanced credit that I could grab, and yeah, it was a struggle. It was a very hard uphill battle. So I think teachers at Cooperstown, at least in my experience, are very good at recognizing students' strengths. I don't think that everyone particularly has, whether they be a teacher or a part of the administration, are particularly good at recognizing where a student needs help, because like I got celebrated for being a smart kid or whatever, but the fact is that like I had a lot of struggles with other things. Like racial identity is just one of them. There was a lot of other things going on that I should have been able to, not to use teachers as my therapists or anything like that, but I should have had a better opportunity to build relationships with my teachers that weren't completely within the classroom, that I could do extracurricular stuff with them and still feel comfortable, and that like they could give me other opportunities to expand my knowledge. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thanks. And this is for Dr. Brown. Do you have any examples of schools that have gotten past the hard conversations and into changing policies?
Yes, I don't want to call anyone out, but Ithaca. I've been here. This is my 11th school year, and we're working to revamp our entire policy manual. We have a Board of Education policy committee that's led by a professor at Ithaca College who studies race and oppression in class every single day. So we've looked at every single policy from a culturally responsive, inclusive, and loving lens, and we have a set of protocols. And we set that protocol sheet next to every policy as we evaluate it. If this policy is not forgiving, we need to change it. If this policy is not showing trust of young people, we need to change it. If this policy is not helping us unearth different histories in our organization and have an appreciation for the histories in our organization and understand power and oppression, we need to change it. So we have a protocol, and it's taken us 10 years to get through that big book. And what we've learned is that now, after we've gone through it, there's some we're going to need to go back and do again, because at the time we didn't have the political will or the courage to make all of the changes we wanted to make the first time. So yeah, I can put in the chat some links to some of our policy work, if that would be helpful.
Definitely. Okay. And I guess this is a question for Angela and Rebecca. Can you explain the support you may get from the administration on this? How can we make your ideas system-wide?
Are you going? Am I going? I guess I'll go. Are we talking about, I guess, support on our program idea, or support in terms of other things we've talked about? I mean,
I'm going to assume it's your program ideas.
Yeah, I guess it's a again, very beginning process, and it's, I guess, a willingness to reach into the professionals that are in both buildings to have those conversations about what we need to do and what changes need to happen. And I think that really it starts with, talking with our colleagues about really examining what we teach. And that's not just in 7th through 12th grade, it's kindergarten through 12th grade. We have to start young in terms of what we're doing within our curriculum. So I guess just a willingness to have those conversations and a willingness to be uncomfortable so that we can figure it out together, because we're in this together, we're a team. And so to really make the big change, we need people on board to talk with us.
And sort of a continuation of that, have you gotten any pushback from other teachers, parents, or community members about additions to the curriculum which engages in education of and including multicultural views, and how do you combat that pushback?
I would say that we've both done our fair share of making students uncomfortable, and maybe contributing to some interesting dining room table conversations. But I'm trying to think, I've never heard at Cooperstown anything to say stop or don't do this anymore. And I've never had a parent complain. When I was at my other school district, there was some pushback. So I don't want to get into too much detail about that, but there was definitely a little pushback. And granted, that was 20 years ago, and it had to do with LGBTQ plus issues, and there was a little pushback. But in that situation, I wasn't going to stop. So it was one of those calculated risks that at the time I was willing to take. And I just think always reflecting, like, is it a way that I presented it? Is there a way that I can do better? Because once someone puts up that wall, the conversation's over. As Dr. Brown was talking about, they've left. They might be sitting in my classroom, but they've left the room. So how do we have the conversations without the people leaving the room? I mean, they're captive in my room, but I want to open their minds and not have them shut out. So it's a constant assessing the room, knowing what you have in the room, knowing the families, knowing the community, and taking a calculated risk as far as what can we discuss, how am I going to present this, how am I going to open their minds. Did I answer the question? I don't know. I feel like I
think too, to be honest, there's no way that we don't make, in terms of like our colleagues and things like that, there's no way we don't make some colleagues feel uncomfortable. But I think that, at least in my experience, I always try to lead with love and compassion in conversations, and I try to stay very measured and calm. And so though someone might be thinking something or not agree with me, if I know and believe it's the right thing to do, then I'm going to do it. And so I think, I definitely think that there's no way that everyone who we work with would agree with everything. But those are the people we need to have conversations with, right? Those are the people that we need to talk with and so I guess I'll leave it at that.
And this one is sort of a very
This will be probably our last question, Joanne.
Okay.
So we're hitting the end here.
For everyone, in the age of COVID, how do we ensure that we are being inclusive, meeting the needs of students who have less privileged backgrounds, like no internet, special needs, or require additional one-on-one support to thrive in an educational environment? And how do we ensure that the pandemic doesn't amplify existing inequalities?
All right.
I can say from
Angel?
from my experience, it is amplifying inequalities, and our job is to kind of figure that out. I have awful internet at my house, and so I'm seeing the effects of being very rural and trying to educate your children. I have 2 young children. And I see socioeconomic status now more than ever in Cooperstown, and all the other things that are tied into that, different learning abilities and different ways of learning. Some kids are thriving doing this because they're just so self-directed. So, and we've really been pushed into this new frontier. So I think I am still experimenting and trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I get all these kids to learn and to grow? Because that's my goal. And geez, we've been at it for 8 months, and I don't think I have an answer, but I can tell you that I'm going to try as hard as I can.
Yeah, I'll echo that. We are learning. I mean, there's that learning to build a plane as you're flying it. And yeah, it really there's a spotlight on inequity. And, you know, just in my own classroom, I recognize it, and I try to be compassionate and creative in problem solving, and listening and reaching out. And though it's very tech heavy on what we're doing, I'm trying to find ways that connect with students that have nothing to do with technology, writing letters, writing postcards, making phone calls, to let them know that I'm here and I see them even if I'm not seeing them. So I think that we're, you know, I also promise I'm going to keep trying my darndest to figure it out.
Louvel, what are your thoughts on as an administrator?
No, I'm encouraged to hear what the educators are saying. Yeah, I mean, this crisis is highlighting the inequities that have always existed in our communities. And what I think is important for folks to know now and to define now is the difference between equity and equal. And listen for the code words folks are going to start to use. Equity is about doing more for those who have less. Equal is very, very different. You're going to start to hear folks say, I want my virtual class to be the same size as those in-person opportunities you're providing. That's about being equal. That's not about being equitable. You're going to hear folks saying, I want more contact with the teacher in my virtual class versus what's happening, because I see what's happening in the in-person experience. That's about equal time, not about equity. So it's just important for us as we talk about this. Yeah, it's you know, just this time last year, people were upset that we were sending home Chromebooks to some kids. Well, they may get lost or they may get broken. Now we can't send home enough devices. Last year this time, we were worried about how much money was on kids' lunch debt accounts. And, you know, what are we going to do when kid has too much debt or they're not paying? You know, everyone can't have a free lunch. Now we're giving everyone free lunch. So things are changing. It brings me great hope that we're going to change, but I am fearful that we're going to default back into that place where our culture always takes us to. I'm going to look out for my own. And I want everything to be equal, not equitable. Because equitable looks like us changing policies. Equitable looks like us meeting the needs of the young people who've been struggling for a long, long time in ways that we haven't, which may be us taking some resources away from those who have privileges.
Jude, did you have any thoughts in terms of sort of education in the COVID era and how that's played out for you at all in your college experience?
I have so many thoughts. But a lot of my experience is tied to the college experience, so I'm going to try and like keep it as general as possible. Frankly, as someone who suffers from ADHD, this whole virtual learning thing has been awful. And I am at the age where I'm like old enough to recognize that I have attention deficit disorder. And on top of that, like a lot of people, nature of this ailment is that a lot of people suffer with it for a very long time through high school, through middle school, through their younger years, not knowing why they can't pay attention. And the whole learning virtually thing is only exacerbating the problem, because it's just too simple. Like you have to create a whole regimen, whereas a kid who doesn't suffer from ADHD or ADD can just sit down, listen to their class, and just stare at the screen. Someone who suffers from ADHD or ADD will like tune in, tune out, tune in, tune out for 5 minutes, 10 minutes at a time, and it affects their ability to learn. Of course, we're working with the best that we got right now, but I feel like Dr. Brown was saying, it's more important than ever to be addressing these issues, because if we don't have an honest conversation about the way that these strainers on our education system affect, especially the most marginalized people that are already suffering to begin with, then we're not going to be able to provide a good education for anybody. It's just the grades are going to go down and classes are going to dwindle, because no one is going to be able to succeed in a system that is designed for no one to succeed in.
That's very well said. Jackie, did you have any final comments before we close out?
No, just thank you for inviting us. Our experience in Cooperstown was unique, and there's so many things about Cooperstown that I love. Julian doing the vaginal monologues with Rebecca and all the plays, and I'm really grateful and I appreciate getting to know a small town like that. And hopefully our input is helpful and can help to begin to change things.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all very much for joining us tonight, the panelists, Joanne, my co-moderator, and all the attendees. This has been great. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but it is after 8 o'clock, and I don't want to keep anybody. Actually, no. Are we? I think we have. Do we have more time? Am I right? We have actually quite a bit more time. 7 to 8:30. I apologize about that. I'm sorry. Let's take some more questions. I apologize for that. I was a little off in my time. But yeah, Joanne, let's take some more questions, please.
Unmute myself here. Okay, I have a question. Oops, sorry, trying to scroll. So another teacher recommended your talk to students to research for debates about human rights. How can they use your stories and experiences as a way in to discussing polarized national issues?
I don't know if this is addressing the question directly, but I have some thoughts here. On our Ithaca City School District website, you can click on learning, and it'll take you then to our curriculum work. The last 5 years, we've taken on tough topics like race and oppression and power and control by developing curriculum. Right now, we have a curriculum we call the anti-marginalization curriculum. And it's pre-K through end of course high school, and every young person is solving a problem that's relevant to their local community. And, it started off with us solving issues around things like, why is the wilderness trail in the back of one of our schools flooding every year? But it evolved to, as we gave young people more voice and choice, to them having a say in what we were going to study and solve. And guess what they told us? So, now my daughter, as an 8-year-old second grader, is having hard conversations in her class about issues around gender and why boys are treated differently than girls in her class and in her house. But you know, in our middle school and high school, they're talking about real issues around race, and they were able to unpack the most recent murders in a real way, where they're trying to figure out how do we solve for this major issue that's impacting us every single day. So an example, you know, it's about the curriculum work and having that embedded in all that you do in a transdisciplinary way, connected to standards where there's some inquiry and young people are solving a real world problem. That's the way to get at it. And that's the way to get at it in a non-threatening way for a community as well. So anti-marginalization curriculum, you can click on our website, you'll see things such as, you know, how to issues around voting rights, to human rights, and to issues around race and class.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, using your experiences, whether as a teacher or student or parent, what do you suggest for teachers to become better multicultural and empathetic purveyors of history and current events, especially when discussing difficult topics to diverse groups of students, i.e. very rural, more urban, economic status, various religious backgrounds, younger students, students of color, etc.?
I think first is getting rid of that fear, and know that, I think, as Rebecca says so beautifully, and it really is her, she leads with love. So if you're leading with love, really be measured, and plan how you're going to approach it. The more planning, the better, I think. And I think really just unpacking that fear and reading, and learning as much as you can from as many perspectives as you can. And it really does help. So with my 8th graders, we've had some great conversations already relating to, like, I'm sure Jude remembers, Harrison Bergeron, and relating that to race, and the Mask of Red Death, and talking about COVID and COVID inequalities and socioeconomic status. But I know the 8th graders. I taught them as 7th graders. Now with the 7th graders that I have this year, I've seen them in person 4 days. So that's going to be a slower process, but you really need to know the students in the room, I think, before you start those conversations, at least in my experience, because then I know where they're coming from so that I can take them somewhere else.
Wonderful. Okay, this
Sorry,
is,
can I add like a bookend on that?
oh, absolutely, sorry.
Okay, great. Yes. So one like final thing on that, I think, is the very first step that I think, you know, is very important to the whole process, is just being willing to have the conversation in the first place. And I think that was a kind of discrimination that I felt. Another form of discrimination that I felt at Cooperstown was that people just weren't willing to talk about, even people close to me, weren't willing to talk about race in any capacity, weren't willing to talk about queer identity issues in any capacity. And so I think people get a little bit too comfortable in their beliefs, and people get a little bit too comfortable in their beliefs, especially when they're young. And at Cooperstown, there's this weird culture of kind of putting everything off until you study government your senior year. And then that's when the debates come out. That's when people will really reveal what they believe. And, you know, everyone is, at least in theory, that everyone is supposed to have an equal floor and is supposed to debate their point. But the fact that these ideas aren't introduced up until you're expected to defend them with scrutiny in front of your fellow classmates is a very strange way, in my opinion, to approach having people think critically about potentially strenuous and politically divisive issues.
Could I say something? There was one great thing that we did, Jude and I, at in Cooperstown. I'm a sexual assault nurse examiner. It's my love, my life, my passion. And we started a program actually at Bassett. And my Jude did a presentation, junior year or senior year?
Junior year.
Junior year. And then Rebecca picked up on it for the seniors going to college. And what I will say is that what was disappointing for me as a parent is that we opened it to parents and they didn't come. And that move from senior year to college and the amount of sexual violence that happens at college is so heartbreaking. So as a parent, what I'm asking the other parents to do is to really get involved with some of these issues at a very, very young age, and to be able to talk to your children about them. And, you know, I was incredibly proud of Jude and the presentation that they did, but more proud of Rebecca and the school for really picking up on it and, you know, doing a presentation for, you know, the outgoing seniors and wanting the parents to be more involved. It's such an important topic, like everything else, that families should be involved and be able to have these difficult conversations.
So Jude and Jacqueline, just so you're aware, we've continued it too. So that program that you started is still going on every year with seniors. We didn't do it last year because of COVID, but every year since. So thank you for that. You've started something that's incredibly important, and it has continued.
I'll come back, Rebecca.
I would love that. I would love it.
Well, now we have Zoom. This is a question for Jacqueline. What extracurricular activities are needed for students coming up in the system so we can celebrate and honor their uniqueness?
I just think everything. I think that what we tried to do for Jude was these game Fridays, and we would buy pizza, sometimes $100 worth of pizza on Friday nights to invite other kids in. But I have to tell you, the most important part, and I remember the beautiful women that invited me into their lives, Karen Katz. I could never thank her enough. And introducing her child to my child because she knew that we were new. That is so important for the moms and the dads to welcome these new families, because otherwise you live in isolation, which was what we did the first whole year. Was we lived in isolation. So it's so important for you guys to reach out to the new people and invite them in and welcome them in, and not just stare at them on the streets, because that was also really intimidating for me and my husband and our children, to think that we looked like some weirdos, which we're not. Different maybe, but so I'm encouraging the moms to get out there and celebrate the new people coming in. Again, Karen, if you're listening, thank you. And for welcoming me to Cooperstown.
Jude, did Identity Alliance exist when you were here? I don't remember.
It did not. It did not exist. I think it was still actually it was
I think it was informal. I think it was all, it wasn't a recognized group at that point, but we did things every year, but it wasn't volunteer basis.
You know what I remember? I remember, well, because I didn't have any time because I was doing extracurricular stuff. I didn't have any time for meetings or anything like that. And I remember talking to you, Rebecca, about it. And I remember specifically because it was the very first year that like the posters were getting torn down every single day. That's what I remember.
The posters are up now.
They're up.
And they stay up.
Yeah.
And yes, so we've definitely had a cultural change around that. I'm so proud to say that the posters are up and not a single one has been touched this year. So I'd like to think we made a difference.
Another question for Dr. Brown. Could you please discuss how American history, social studies at the Ithaca schools is taught in a way that encompasses the full range of American history, that encompasses the gaps that Jude mentioned?
Well, I would say the way in which we teach not only those subjects, but all of them, it includes a significant amount of self-reflection, self-correction, criticism of the ways in which we do it. We've established an advisory council on critical race theory and ethnic studies. And this group of community leaders, and I'm facilitating the group, we spend a lot of time talking about instructional practices as they relate to history, race, law, power. This group is going to be offering recommendations to our Board of Education and to our faculty around how do we reclaim marginalized voices in histories. How do we involve field experiences that bring in the equity and the diversity that we have had missing from our schools? This group is going to be offering recommendations about how we can have all of our young people engage more deeply and draw connections between the histories of the various cultures. So I would say that's for every subject. I was just in a virtual math class today where they were, unpacking the most recent race, the marches and movements around race and where people were going and how they were organizing and protesting and making it and turning it into an algebra problem. How can you get a certain number of people physically distanced apart in a certain stadium? So, every one of our subject areas is going after understanding race, oppression, and marginalization in different ways. So I hope that helps. It's still connected to the standards, but we're asking ourselves to unearth different perspectives and histories as we do the things that New York State says we must do.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so listening to Jude's experience, I'm struck by the fact that a lot of bias he faced came largely from the administration and not just fellow students. Is there a sense that because we are not a diverse community that these issues are not considered important to address in our schools?
Should I speak to that? Okay. I don't think the first and primary issue, I'll start here. When you have a community as insular as Cooperstown, the first time that a Black person comes to town shouldn't be the first time that we're talking about race. And I don't think that's particularly because of a failure of diversity. I think that's because that's a failure on education, on what is mandated, and especially because Cooperstown is a public school, what is mandated by the state that we must teach. And so if kids have only been fed perspective, if kids have only been fed perspective of like Black people, of like, well, the history book says they're slaves and the TV says they're athletes, and that's all I got. And the fact is, when I came to Cooperstown, when it proved that I am a terrible athlete, people had no idea what to do with me. So I think diversity shouldn't be the thing that we focus on. I think we should focus on education. And it's frankly, there are frankly more powerful systems at hand here than just like Cooperstown is like nowhere near a city, and like there's going to be less diversity as a result of that. I think the power structures of racism that exist within Cooperstown are far more deep than that. It's about what everyone sees on the TV every night. It's about like the kind of programming that people in Cooperstown engage in. It's about like what people are reading at book clubs. It's about, what people are discussing at the dinner table. It's all Black people were, of course, Black people for a lot of people in Cooperstown were an idea. And I don't need to bring up the last time that there were racism talks at Cooperstown, that Black people were an idea. back then, and they were an idea right when I arrived as well. So when you are treated as an idea, you are dehumanized. That, you know, I didn't have the opportunity to succeed that I needed to in Cooperstown because I was dehumanized, and that's a form of racism. So I don't think if there were other Black people in Cooperstown that it would have been significantly better, because there were some other Black people and they were treated just the same. So I was not the only person of color. I was especially not the only Black person at Cooperstown High, but I definitely felt the ramifications. Like my entire first year of Cooperstown, at Cooperstown, I would not stop hearing it left and right. People just saying like, you heard about what happened to the last Black guy who was here, right? And it's like, it was a terrible legacy that I had to like constantly be fighting against, just by virtue of being a Black guy. So to answer the question, I don't think diversity will solve the problem. I think education will solve the problem.
Thank you. A comment. As a CCS parent, I am so grateful for our teachers, always so devoted to their students. And I am so impressed with the work the teachers have done this summer to learn and grow and meet this moment in history for themselves and the students. It's a difficult time for everyone. We're fortunate that despite the obstacles, the teachers are committed to equity. It would be great to see the school board do this policy examination of the type Dr. Brown described they are doing in Ithaca. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Okay. For Dr. Brown, the Ithaca district is larger than Cooperstown and has some elements of rural white farm communities and elements of more urban communities of color. How does Ithaca approach the union of students with differing ideas and biases? How do teachers in the district approach ingrained stereotypes from students and adults in the community?
Again, this is systemic, and it's a policy issue that needs to be reversed. We all have, Ithaca has been known for the tracks that we have at our middle and high school. We had to detrack for excellence. We had to collapse levels. We had to have it was educational malpractice for me to walk in on my first day on the job and be able to tell the level of a course based on what the kids look like who were in the classrooms. We needed to fix that. Heterogeneous groupings in mathematics at the middle school, moving away from the multiple tracks at our high school. One, having young people be in the same space together. And that starts with a policy issue and a structural issue around how we educate them. And that's not just during the school day, it's after school as well. We can also look at our athletic and other and music and arts, fine art programs, and see there are certain faces and certain histories and cultures that aren't represented in certain aspects of that. We needed to address that too. So what I say, when I arrived at Ithaca, there were conversations about race riots and significant fights. After being there 4 or 5 years, people asked at a public meeting, whatever happened to all the fights that you were having, the race fights? And I responded with, well, they're all playing on the same teams now. It's kind of hard to fight someone who's blocking for you, or someone you're going to pass to, or someone you're playing an instrument and you're making sweet music with together. And before I arrived, they weren't integrated. And so again, I hope that I'm giving you some sense. We got to celebrate and embrace the diversity, which makes us stronger, not separate and segregate it to maintain the silos and institutional oppressive systems that we were designed to be.
Another question. It's not as much pushback that is a problem. The problem is a lack of urgency to combat racism. How do we get other teachers to the point of conflict when they are indifferent?
I wish I knew the answer to that one. Because I think as Dr. Brown was talking about, it has to start with a lot of reflection and a lot of thought. And if people aren't ready for that, how do we get them there? So I'm not, maybe he has an answer.
You know, I would just say fear of open conflict and a right to comfort are two key elements of supremacy culture that we're going to hold on to. Unless we are purposeful in our design of activities and workshops and conversations that push people beyond being just uncomfortable. We can share a couple of articles about equity and diversity and make people uncomfortable. But to really engage in the dialogue about our oppressive practices and how we need to change them to be more equitable and to embrace diversity, that's where you're going to get people to struggle. That's when they start to come out to the Board of Education meetings and they start screaming at the superintendent and the board for changing that policy. That's when you start seeing people rip posters off the walls. See, that struggle is what we have to look for and embrace and lean into and not run away from. Too often school districts, when that struggle starts, we start to then appease the loudest voices, or we back away, or we make compromises. As my friend Ibram Kendi says, you're either an anti-racist or you're a racist in today and age. And no longer can we accept neutrality. So that indifference is neutrality. Folks just being uncomfortable is neutrality. If you're not seeing the struggle, we aren't doing the real work.
Wonderful. Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry, last question, I guess,
Okay.
if we've got one more.
All right, so adding diversity to curricula is surely mandated in some way in what we establish across this, across the system. What is the grievance protocol, for example, when what remedies does a student who feels discriminated against have? Is diversity curricula mandated?
It is part of the English standards. I can't speak to the other standards, but it is part of the English standards. I would say as a student and as a parent that you speak to the teacher. Send an email if you don't feel comfortable, speak to the teacher or a trusted, and if that doesn't do anything, talk to a trusted adult or a guidance counselor. We have Mrs. Roberts is lovely and the guidance staff here. And see what changes you can make, because maybe as a teacher, we haven't always thought of it, or maybe I haven't been exposed to it, or I'm unaware. We're learning too. So maybe there are kids that have good ideas. And I think that knowing that they want to learn also, empowers me and excites me. So I can't think of anyone that wouldn't embrace an idea for a learning experience.
Yeah, I would just echo that, reach out to the teachers. They're amazing. I have 3 boys and my boys have had both of these wonderful women as English teachers. So, and you'll be amazed by the reception that you'll get. They're not scary people.
I will just add that as a parent, my daughter experienced a lot of difficulty with one teacher in particular regarding being kind of, I'm biracial, half Asian, and so she's part Asian as well, and was kind of pointed out, she was the token Asian in the class, and was constantly being asked, what do you think as the Asian person on this particular issue? And it became increasingly uncomfortable for her, and eventually got the administration involved in working with this teacher to try to address those issues. But I have to say it wasn't easy, and there wasn't necessarily a set process for doing this. And I don't know how, it's not clear to me that there were any changes on the part of that teacher other than an apology. But I think that perhaps this is where Lou Val could talk about sort of policy changes that might be necessary to make that, easier for someone to address.
Yeah, I don't know if that was a question from you or not, but there there are specific policy. I think New York State School Boards Association mandates a policy that allows for this issue to be addressed. And I don't know that, I'm going to be doing some research tonight, and I'll be looking at your policy manual. I think there should be a policy on the books that allows for this to be addressed. But the fact that most folks don't know about it is the issue in itself.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we are actually at 8:30 now. I apologize again for not having my time right. But I want to thank you all for joining us here. And if we didn't get to your question, I apologize. This was a terrific discussion. And I'm going to share my screen just really quickly to raise, let's see. So again, just thanking all of you, all these wonderful panelists for this terrific discussion. And just really quickly about what's coming up next. On October 18, we have the Friends of Village Library has a Sunday speaker series. It's beginning with a discussion with Gretchen Soren, author of Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights, which is extremely timely. And I believe last Tuesday there was a showing of the documentary related to this book that was on PBS. So that should be a great discussion. On October 28th, we'll have the fourth session on Cooperstown Reflects on Racism, which will be on healthcare with several doctors from Bassett, as well as Vince Solomon, a social worker, and Candace Shannon, social psychologist and sociologist. And then finally, November 15 is the second in the Sunday Speaker Series, which is going to be a book, the community book read of The Underground Railroad with George Hovis, professor of English at SUNY Oneonta. So we'll be discussing that book. And then coming up, there will be additional sessions in December, I believe, on that I won't bring up right now regarding the additional Sunday Speaker Series, but we'll be concluding restarting the racism series in January and February with discussions on law enforcement, housing, and historic preservation, culture, and the arts, and then a sort of a culminating session of what steps are we going to take. So again, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you all online soon. Thank you very much. Bye.